Tonight we're going to be learning more about how we reconnect parts of our city. I do want to recognize how many people were left out in the cold because of what happened now 75 years ago. How did the new highways impact the people of Seattle, and what do you think are the next steps?
The highway projects were undeniably successful in connecting cities across the United States. But as Sally had mentioned, it came at enormous, and now in hindsight, multi-generational cost. The benefits were not uniformly experienced as the new interstate system, as was the case here in Seattle, gutted communities and sometimes intentionally reinforced racist practices such as redlining and segregation. And communities across the country, but certainly here in Seattle, lost places of worship, green space, whole swaths of homes. I-5, as you saw in a lot of the posters around us, literally split and severed our city. And also, same with the Alaskan Way Viaduct, which previously severed our waterfront.
So in Washington, many of these freeways and ramps have been patched up and continue to be repaired piecemeal. Some of the neighborhoods have been totally ignored, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about WashDOT's position with the feds and future funding needs.
All of those projects that Sally said I had the great opportunity to work on, those were possible because our state legislature funded them. What didn't get funded through the last 25 years then was commensurate investment in preservation across the state.
Maybe you talk a little bit more about the legislature and maybe even Congress.
I will say it's a really fluid time. I had the executive orders hit our inboxes early in the Trump administration, and over 3 days we still weren't quite sure what those executive orders meant. I will share more when we know more. Yep.
Thank you. While you are an urban planner, and a lot of us are interested in what other cities are doing, what other lids have looked like, what do you see, and who is leading the charge on what Seattle could become with the lids?
Picture in your mind the Pike Place Market, the entrance to the Pike Place Market at Pike Place and Pike Street. There's the clock, there's the sign, there's food for sale, there's a busker, there's a pig, there's stairs down to the waterfront, there's fish flying through the air. All the things that are going on in this area that's less than 5,000 square feet. To make these spaces work, and this is something we've found both here, but also from examples around the country, activation, thoughtful activation, really finding uses that are engaging, and how can we make sure that we respond to those needs, the needs for activation, the need for comfort, the need for intuitive design. How can we do that well?
You are well known for your political acumen. When have you seen Seattle at its best, and how can we take that best to apply to the lid?
I think that when we reflect back on our city's history, we're at its best when we have a bold idea and we figure out a way and build the political will to realize that bold idea. In 1889, we had a huge Seattle fire, almost lost our city. The very next day, if you know that wonderful story, people came together and said, we're going to rebuild this story. They could have done, we could all be in Tacoma having this conversation. We hosted the 1962 World's Fair that gave us the Seattle Center. We built Freeway Park. We had the viaduct demolition in 2019. We had the new aquarium and the Overlook Walk that was just discussed. And now we're going to reopen the waterfront after demolishing the viaduct. There is a lot happening, and even though this project seems daunting, if you think about it in that context, it is actually a logical progression of the kinds of assets that we need to build to make a more livable and sustainable city.
I want to come back to you, Julie, about ways that Seattle and WashDOT can work together to make the LID I-5 vision part of your master plan.
Our goal on that program is to look at I-5, high-speed rail, and air mobility, all of those modes together. What land use do we need to support these modes? How will our communities connect? We'll be working with the LID I-5 group so that we can incorporate their thoughts into the I-5 master plan. And the thing that started off the Lascaux Viaduct was to note that it was a vulnerable structure. And over the last several years, we've done an analysis of I-5 through the city, and it isn't just the bridges that are vulnerable. We built those walls, we built the off-ramps. Those are all structures designed under a very old and now non-standard design criteria, and we wouldn't do that today. What we're looking at is how the connections will work on I-5. So if you start redoing the connections and understanding how that moves people around differently, how they will move. One of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about is what is on the lids. You put new housing on it, you put new buildings on it, how is that gonna help the area around it? So you have to be very thoughtful about what goes on the lid and how that interrelates to the neighborhoods and the roadways. I think that's where we could really make a difference together.
And in the long-term, resiliency is a common theme I hear all the time. And we appreciate the fact that the economic status quo is tough downtown. Resiliency means improved economy, but also more people coming down, better pedestrian connections, people feel safe.
And what I would say is that one of the things that made downtown and continues to make downtown resilient and leads to the value proposition for the LID is the residents of downtown. Downtown Seattle grew faster than probably one of the any urban center in the decade prior to the pandemic. People came down to downtown Seattle because they saw the ecosystem of the things that make living downtown great. You know, whether it's arts and culture, whether it's strong retail, whether it's entertainment. We need to have these kinds of amenities that will provide those kinds of connections, make living in this and working in this part of Seattle that much richer and joyful.
Just imagine what we now have on our waterfront, and with that overlook walk and being able to walk up through Pike Place Market and straight up Pike and Pine to like Melrose Center up on Capitol Hill. Just, can you describe a little bit more about how do we connect that with the LID?
We have this now terrific corridor on the waterfront. How do we build on that? And I think the vision of the perpendicular, in other words, a number of corridors of streets, connections that are perpendicular to the waterfront that take you up across to First Hill, to Capitol Hill, through the International District, is a really compelling idea. And so prioritizing where those crossings want to be first, what are some of the synergisms that we can work with to get there.
You know, there are certain people who's like, no, it's not. And I keep saying it is happening in other cities. We know it can happen here. Can you talk a little bit more about the elements that have been successful in some of the other cities?
Yeah, I mean, they vary. There are some projects that are 100% public space. There's no private anything, all the way to, say, Capitol Crossings in Washington, D.C., which is essentially 100% private. It's worth pointing out, you know, we've already done 2 lids over I-5 in the last 50 years. And when you look regionally, we've done, you know, scores of lids.
We talked a little bit ago about Montlake and the connection both with the pedestrian and bicycle, but can you talk a little bit, Julie, about how you brought the community along?
The good thing about the Montlake community is they weren't shy about telling us what they wanted, and so they did engage. It's almost impossible to get ideas from some communities when they, for whatever reasons, don't participate. And I think at times I met with everybody along Lake Washington Boulevard, or the team did. And it takes that kind of input, I think, to get a conclusion that, as Lyle said, is richer than it would have been otherwise. And then going down to Olympia and said, no, this is really what we need to do. So it was a collaboration from the neighborhood to the local jurisdiction to the UW.
How would you say that we can do more of that, build the enthusiasm that is going to be needed in the long run?
This project has had a technical feasibility, which shows that it can be done. And I would argue that you also need to have a political feasibility study that can determine whether sufficient political will can be established. And that's where I actually think this project and initiative has enormous strategic advantage. You think about what it took to build the Political Coalition for Sound Transit 3, largest tax increase in the history of this region, but that took business, labor, and the environmentalists coming together. The Central Waterfront, all of these things required a very intentional effort. The final step is we do need to have a strong leader, whether it's the mayor, somebody who is going to be able to make this a priority for the city.
It's the people in this room that are going to make this happen, that we are the coalition that are going to keep it going. You look at the waterfront, when we got started, it was before Greg Nichols. And, think of the number of mayors that we had between then and now to Bruce Harrell. And the enthusiasm that kept pushing were the people that had the vision to say, this can get done, and it did. Okay, Lyle, back to you. Can you talk a little bit more about what you have seen, the benefits for the cities?
Yeah, I think there's the obvious benefit. There's restoration, restoring connection, all of the positives that come from correcting a terrible mistake of the past. But I think one of the great things, and the waterfront certainly proved this to be the case, but I think the Living by 5 is the next thing. I think there's a powerful statement about a place making things better, demonstrably making something that's not great better. And that's why I am especially excited about this proposal. Not just improving connections to the downtown, making the downtown work better, but also just the fundamental statement about investment and caring and energy and all the things that come when you can champion a successful project like this.
We have seen chaos generated in the last 4 weeks. I know we don't have an answer. None of us do, and it's changing 5 times a day, as you pointed out, Julie. But talk about how do we deal with this?
I think things are never as bad as they look. So today it does look dire. And even when it's great, it's never as good. So I offer you that middle of the round here. I think it will flatten out here in a bit. And I think the only way that we can make it better is to engage in ways like we are here tonight and let our leadership know what we think is important. And we just need you to help us with that. And all the things my co-panelists said about light rail and backing that and backing the waterfront, those are the things I think that are going to help us.
We were a company town in the 60s and 70s. And in the early 70s, Boeing lost, in a very short period of time, something like 60,000 employees. And yet somehow in that decade, we managed to preserve the market, establish a historic district in Pioneer Square, the aquarium, and importantly, Freeway Park.
Julie, is there anything those of us in this room can do to support you, support WashDOT's effort, either with the legislature or with Congress right now or with our senators?
Well, I will say with the state legislature, it's in session now. So COVID did bring us one good thing, and that is you can participate remotely on that. And if you want to, you can go down and testify for what you value. So I encourage you to participate in the legislative process. It's going right now. If you think that things need to change in DC, now is the time to make your voice heard and contact your leadership.
I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about what lessons we learned from the waterfront that could be applied to I-5.
The Central Waterfront formed a stewardship entity that helped to institutionalize and maintain momentum and continuity of this project across multiple mayoral administrations. So for those of you that have been following that project, Friends of the Waterfront came together. An external group of civic leaders were there not only to be boosters, but also to maintain accountability of the project with its city partners. And so forming some kind of a stewardship entity, as was done in the waterfront, would be something that would continue to be able to carry this project across multiple administrations, elections, until we get to the finish line, as will be the case here very, very shortly for the opening of the Central Waterfront.